Welcome to this A-level economics exam guidance for paper 1, 2 and 3. I'm John Greenwood, Head of Economics at St Olave's.
And I'm William Haynes, Teacher of Economics at St Olave's. So I'm just going to talk through 5 common exam tips that apply to both paper 1 and paper 2. The first is just the outline of the papers. So make sure that you complete paper 1, 2 and 3 in the order that they are given. That means doing the multiple choice first to hopefully ease your nerves and give you some confidence, and then move on to the data response and finally the essay. The reason to do the essay at the end is that there may be some application in the data response that may support your essay answer. Paper 1 is the micro paper and paper 2 is the macro paper, each of which will have a 45% split from year 12 and then a 55% split from year 13. Make sure that you spend 25 minutes on the multiple choice and no more than that. That will leave you then 60 minutes to do the data response and finally 30 minutes on the essay, which then gives you a 5-minute buffer just to go through everything if you are stuck for time.
If we look at the common exam structure, what we will see is that paper 1 and paper 2 in the data sections have 5 questions in total. What will happen is that you need to be aware very clearly it is about the quality of writing that they assess this on. However, there are things that the exam board are specifically looking for. So if we take the 5 marker for instance, quite often you can get or you can work with 1 point, and what you do need to do is make sure that you really hone in on identifying 2 pieces of data from the text. You then need to explain your point. Probably it will be a very short response, but you do need to make sure I've got 1 response or 1 point, 1 piece of data or 2 pieces of data, and likewise some explanation of my point. Secondly, the 8 marker is 1 point, and this can often be complemented with a diagram. The diagram should be maybe explained, saying what's happened to price or output respectively, and then likewise some or 1 piece of evaluation. Part C works by looking at 1 point, again a diagram and some evaluation, but this is in a little bit more greater depth, so really picking out maybe the nuances of what might be happening to maybe profit, price and output, and the evaluation should be stronger, thinking about potentially the extent of the point that you're making to get the 12 marks overall. The 10 marker is again 1 point, a diagram and evaluation. It doesn't need to contain a lot of depth, but what it does need to do is accurately show a good chain of reason why X leads to Y, which leads to Z, and the Y's in the middle. And part E, the idea of the 15 marker, what will happen is that we're looking at 2 points and 2 pieces of evaluation. In depth, it differs from the essay that you will follow later on because it doesn't need a conclusion, but you do again need to use theory precisely, explaining diagrams and questioning the extent to which your points will happen.
Common exam tip 3 is just looking at the mark scheme for the essay questions, which are 25 mark questions, and just to show maybe the difference between level 4 and level 3 and interpreting the mark scheme that Edexcel have given. So it's really important that we have precise knowledge in terms of your analysis, and that means precise knowledge of theory and concepts, and also accuracy in drawing diagrams. The second thing to look at is the use of context, and in the essays that will be your knowledge of maybe the global economy, or in paper 1 your knowledge of firms and markets, and also obviously your knowledge of the extract as well. Your analysis needs to be focused on the question, so it has a big emphasis on being relevant to the question. So make sure that you're continually linking back your chains of reasoning to the focus of the question. And these chains of reasoning have plenty of depth, so we're going through multiple stages of your chains of analysis. In terms of evaluation, level 3 is looking at, again, making sure you've got in-depth reasoning. So again, it's about the depth of the point, not the quantity of points that you are making. Evaluation is, again, contextual. That will get you the higher level. And also, if you can critically analyze the assumptions of a model, that will also put you into the higher level in terms of your evaluation. Finally, then you need to come to some form of conclusion, and this needs to be a reasoned judgment. So making sure that you just explain what the answer effectively to the question is, and you just support it with a follow-up sentence just to explain your reason why.
Okay, looking at the essays, what you need to make sure you do is when you read the essay question, very clearly work out the key terms that are on offer in the essay. You should define the key terms at the start of your essay. The essay does not need a long rambling introduction, but the examiner is clearly looking for an understanding of clear and concise terminology. What you should then do is write your first point of analysis. Make your point, but also try to consider the context of the question. So the context needs to really, or your point needs to link to the situation on offer. So if it applies to a firm or to a developing country, you need to consciously tailor your point to that. Likewise, you should try to develop theory, so X leads to Y, which leads to Z, but the examiner is specifically looking for why it or X leads to Y, and you need to unfold or unscaffold all of those comments that go between the two. You should also look to use a model in your point of analysis. So for example, I call this big theory, but using ADAS if it's a macro response, a Laffer curve, an externalities diagram, but you should be using some form of diagram to help develop your analysis. What you also need to do is make sure you explain that analysis. So don't just put it in or bung it in, as I say to my students. You need to use it to help say what's happening to price, what's happening to output, what's happening to employment, for example, as part of those diagrams. What you also then need to do is write out your first point of evaluation. So again, I always tell people to go back to their point and read the first line and then say, okay, the extent to which this has happened, and link it back as well to the context. State your point, however, this may not happen or this may not occur, or in evaluation of this point, etc. But linking it back to your point and to the question is absolutely critical. In total, you should have 2 points of analysis and 2 points of evaluation. And then you should conclude by coming to a reasoned judgment. That reasoned judgment needs to be, in a way, brief, and it shouldn't regurgitate a lot of what you've written before. It should be balanced on what you have written, saying, well, actually, we think, or based on the evidence, this will happen overall. It can lean to a particular direction if you wish, based on the points that you're making, but make sure it's clear, concise, and balanced.
The final exam tip that we're just going to talk through is in terms of the data response. So you have 60 minutes to complete the 50 marks in the data response. It is absolutely essential that you dedicate some time to simply reading the extract and planning some answers, because this will give you some direction in terms of where you are going in answering the question. So we tell our students to make sure they give themselves 10 minutes to reading the extract and planning. The first thing you should do is to read the questions carefully. And the reason for this is that it gives you some focus when you go on to read the extract. Then make sure that you go through the extract and you are annotating key points and data references where possible. Once you've read the extract, then go back to the question and start just jotting down very briefly some key points of analysis and evaluation for each question. If you can get all of your thinking time done within this 10 minutes and you've got direction in terms of every question, then all you have to do for the remaining 50 minutes is to simply write the answer. So an example of this is just seen on the screen at the moment. So what this candidate has done is highlighted each question with a different colour. They have then gone on to read the extract, and as a result of that, they have used that specific highlighter pen in order to identify where the answers to that specific question is. Now, it may seem like overkill, but it means that the candidate has a clear point of reference for each question in order to go back to, and can always pick out those data references, the specific answers to that question. The extract is there to support you, and what you will find is most of the answers to the questions will be in this extract. So it's absolutely vital when you do read through it that you pick as many points from the extract as possible, and you are constantly annotating the extract so that you can keep moving back and forth between the questions and the extract.
With respect to paper 1, often students consider what can I write or what points could I make. Sometimes the questions are very open, but students find it difficult to identify points. I call this very clearly an opportunity for a clear model to be applied. Can I think about this question? So what you have very clearly on the screen are the idea of 4 areas which I think are vital for students to consider when answering any questions in the micro section. So for example, I would suggest that students always consider what does it do to price, what does it do to profit, how will this affect output, and how will it affect the firm, etc. Let's develop that idea. So for example, if we are looking at price in maybe a demand and supply scenario, you could comment on what that would therefore do to consumer surplus, and you could use a demand and supply diagram. Secondly, if it was theory of the firm, monopoly, perfect competition, etc., you can always comment on profit. So what will it do to supernormal profit? What will it do to normal profit? You could question the idea of producer surplus, likewise as you've got above consumer surplus as well. You can draw a revenue and cost diagram to support. A little tip is that quite often if a firm's revenue is going up, its profit will be going up, but you can always question what is happening to costs as well at the same point evaluatively as well. You can also look at what's happening to output. So the question is, if a firm suddenly starts to or sees an increase in revenue, etc., it might find that its output may increase or decrease depending on the shift. You can look at that and question what's happening to output, but consider whether the consumer is getting more welfare or less welfare overall. This takes you into a route of even considering positive and negative externalities that go with that. Likewise, it's always good to consider possibly the labour market angle. So quite often we could be looking at how a situation could affect the wage rate in the market, for instance. Is it making the possibility of firms' power more obvious? So can they maybe push down wages such as a monopsony? Or is it making workers more powerful to have an influence on their wages overall? So there's important areas to consider, and if you consider at the back of your mind price, profit, output, firm, and potentially the comments to the right on the screen, you can open up layers of analysis which could be relevant to many questions overall. So many students often ask, how do I develop my response? This is a paper 1 response. What we've done is we've looked at a very basic response and a far better response. Now, if you visually just look at this response, what you notice is the lack of development. So what's happening in this situation is the candidate visually has not used any form of diagram to support their analysis. This is critical if we want to get into those higher levels. So the idea of KL3 or KL4. Likewise, there is a limited change of reason. So for example, the candidate says the merger would enable Cineworld to charge higher prices for consumers as they will have less choice. Cineworld will be able to act more like a monopoly in the towns concerned, taken from the question. The candidate does not develop this overall or develop how the monopoly will work, what it will mean with respect to price, what it will mean with respect to output, what it will mean with respect to consumer welfare. Likewise, if we look at the evaluation section, the candidate uses a very, very basic approach to evaluation. So they do use the word significant as part of their work, but again, they don't really develop that and say why or how or apply theory. Okay. This is a more detailed response. Immediately, if we look at the response, the layout is striking. So for instance, what do you immediately see? You see some analysis immediately, you see a diagram, and then you see detailed, in-depth evaluation. If we unpick that a little bit, so in the analysis, we can see clearly reference here to consumer surplus. So the idea is the candidate is saying, well, what's going to happen to consumer surplus and what does it mean for welfare? Likewise, the candidate talks about what's happening to price as part of their work and output. They then make a comment in this section on the diagram as well. They then talk about the evaluation. It shows depth. So it talks about the idea of why, in this case, Cineworld might be what we would call reluctant to raise prices. And likewise, what it might do in terms of if they do raise prices, that they might face further regulation overall. They then also, at the end of this evaluation, apply to the context again. So they are using the data within their evaluation to apply to the context. It's far more detailed. I can clearly see deep analysis, use of diagram being explained, and context and development within the evaluation.
So we're now going to look at a paper 2 sample response. This is the 10 marker from the sample Edexcel paper looking at the benefits of membership of the EAC. So as you can see, this candidate has just written a huge block text which with no clear distinction between where the analysis is and where the evaluation lies. Now the point that the candidate makes is fine. As you can see, then the application that the candidate uses is just not relevant to the point that is being made. It is from the extract and it does have some association with the EAC, but it's not talking about what the benefits for Kenya are. The candidate then has a very limited chain of reasoning, saying as a result, the lower tariffs will lead to a rise in exports and higher levels of growth. This is correct in what they are saying, but it needs to be drawn out into stages of an argument. The candidate then uses a very generic use of evaluation, so however, this depends on the magnitude in the reduction of tariff. This may get some credit, but will certainly not go into the higher levels of evaluation. So please make sure, as candidates, make sure that you do not use generic points of evaluation and your evaluation is specific to the actual point. Finally, a diagram is used, which is great, but it is of no use when the diagram is not linked to the analysis. And we can see inaccuracy in the labelling of the diagram with the use of quantity rather than real GDP or output. This is then the same response to the question. This would be all you need to potentially write for a 10 marker with 1 point of analysis plus your diagram to support that and a point of evaluation. So the reason this piece is better is that the application is relevant to the point that is being made and there's been data reference. There is then a clear chain of reasonings stating with lower barriers to trade, Kenya's export will become more attractive to other members, and this will mean that there will be a rise in demand. As exports are a component of aggregate demand, this leads to an outward shift in AD to AD2. Again, link to the diagram. In addition to this, you could argue that has the candidate spoken about two different points within this. They've touched upon the current account in terms of a macroeconomic objective. They've also touched upon the impact on growth. So there is an argument here that our candidate has touched upon two different points within the same chain of reasoning. The evaluation then is more developed and it is applied to the extract. So there's a second data reference within the evaluation, which has then gone on to be explained in further detail. And this is why this piece would get more credit and towards the higher levels of analysis and evaluation compared to the first one.
Paper 3 is the micro and macro paper. This, I think, for many students is probably the more daunting of many papers because for the first time it's a little bit more open and free. It's synoptic as well. It's testing how you use economics and the range of your skills and ability. If we look at the synoptic paper, what do we need to understand? There will be two data response questions, or two data response sections, both worth 25 marks each, where you will get a 5, an 8 and a 12. And then there are two essays worth, or with a choice, that you can get a further 25 marks on. What you need to understand is that it is very, very important when you're answering this. In the data response sections, you will very clearly use the same style as in paper 1 and in paper 2. In the essays, it is very, very important that, again, key terms are defined, but what you should also be trying to do is say, well, look, I've got 2 points that I need to really use here with 2 pieces of evaluation. The first point should be a micro point, and you should say to the examiner, 1 micro benefit of etc. And then the second point would be 1 macro benefit. You should also evaluate each point, and there should be evidence of clear use of what we call big theory, ASAD, Laffer curve, etc. Your revision from this will come from concepts and learning paper 1 material and paper 2 material thoroughly. Don't be scared to use the full extent of your economics.
So the 25-mark essay in the paper 3, the synoptic paper, will tend to ask what the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects are of something. So in this case, I've just got an example of the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of a depreciation of the real on Brazil's economy. So in terms of the microeconomic effect, just a few things to consider. So we can look at our individual economic agents, which are the individual or the household, the firm, and the government. Now, I've put government in brackets because you could argue that it falls under macroeconomic category as well. So your microeconomic point should always think about what is the impact on the firm and what is the impact on the individual. In terms of the macroeconomic effect, you just need to consider all of the macroeconomic objectives. Now, I've only just got a few on here on this slide, and there are others, but these are the sort of 4 main ones to consider. So what would be the impact on growth? What would be the impact on employment? What would be the impact on inflation? And what would be the impact on the balance of payments? Everything that we have spoken about in these slides is based upon our interpretation of the sample paper and all the information that we have received from Edexcel. Now, it is clear, and we want to make it clear to you, that this is not guidance from the exam board themselves, and it is just simply our interpretation of how we think we should structure some answers and some of the key things to make sure that you continually link answers to, and what differentiates a level 1 or 2 response to a level 3 or a level 4 response.